Balin knew a Balrog lived in Moria, and he went anyway. When the Fellowship enters Khazad-dûm, they find his tomb deep in the halls. The inscription reads,
"Here lies Balin, son of Hundin, Lord of Moria."
which raises an obvious question. If Balin became Lord of Moria, the Dwarves must have reclaimed the kingdom. So what really happened inside the mines, and how did it end in disaster? For most viewers, Balin's expedition to Moria is understood almost entirely through its portrayal in the film The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. When the Fellowship enters the mines, they encounter only the aftermath of disaster. The halls are abandoned, the gates lie broken. The once great dwarf kingdom appears to have become nothing more than a grave. Eventually, the company reaches the Chamber of Mazarbul, where Gandalf discovers a damaged record book describing the final moments of Balin's colony. The entries tell of orc attacks, desperate defenses, and a slow collapse of the dwarven settlement. The final lines are chilling.
"We cannot get out. They are coming."
This scene leaves a very clear impression. Balin's expedition was a tragic mistake. The dwarves entered Moria, encountered overwhelming enemies, and were ultimately destroyed by the dangers that still haunted the ancient kingdom. Many fans assume that the colony must have failed quickly, perhaps within months, once the dwarves discovered that orcs still inhabited the mines and that Durin's Bane, the Balrog, remained somewhere in the depths. But Tolkien's writing suggests a more complex story. The expedition did not immediately collapse. In fact, the surviving records indicate that Balin and his followers established a functioning colony inside Moria and held it for several years before everything went wrong. The dwarves successfully entered Khazad-dûm, drove out orc forces in several areas, and re-established a working settlement in the ancient halls of their ancestors. Balin claimed the title Lord of Moria, and that tells us a lot. It wasn't just a poetic flourish. It implied real political control over the Eastern Halls, a sense of psychological confidence amongst his followers, and a message to Erebor that this was more than a risky expedition. Balin was presenting his colony as the rebirth of a kingdom, not a temporary outpost. Because if Balin truly held authority within Moria, even temporarily, then the dwarves must have reclaimed at least part of the kingdom, restoring life to a place that had been abandoned for centuries. So the real mystery is not simply why the colony failed. The deeper question is this: how close did Balin actually come to reclaiming Moria? To answer that, we need to examine several pieces of Tolkien's lore. First, we must understand why the dwarves of Erebor were drawn back to Khazad-dûm in the first place. Second, we need to look at the timeline of Balin's expedition and what their surviving records tell us about the early years of the colony. And finally, we must examine the moment when everything began to unravel. Only by putting these pieces together can we determine whether Balin's expedition was truly doomed, or whether, for a short time, the dwarves actually succeeded in reclaiming the ancient kingdom of Durin. To understand why Balin's expedition was even possible, we first need to look at the long history of Khazad-dûm. Khazad-dûm, later known as Moria, was the greatest kingdom ever built by the dwarves of Middle-earth. It was founded in the earliest days of the world by Durin the Deathless, the eldest of the 7 fathers of the dwarves. For thousands of years, Durin's folk ruled there, mining vast wealth from the misty mountains and expanding their halls deep beneath the stone. The kingdom flourished through the First and Second Ages, but during the Third Age, the dwarves dug too deeply in search of mithril and awakened a terrible ancient creature, a Balrog of Morgoth that had slept beneath the mountains since the fall of Angband. This event changed everything. In the year 1980 of the Third Age, the Balrog killed King Durin VI. The following year it killed his son Nian I, and the dwarves were forced to abandon Khazad-dûm entirely. From that moment forward, the creature became known among the dwarves as Durin's Bane. For centuries afterward, the once great kingdom remained empty. But the story did not end there. In the year 2790, Thror, the grandfather of Thorin Oakenshield, attempted to enter Moria alone. He was killed by the orc chieftain Azog outside the gates. This act sparked the War of the Dwarves and Orcs, which lasted for years, and culminated in the Great Battle of Azanulbazar before the East Gate of Moria. After the battle, the dwarf lord Dane Ironfoot looked into the dark entrance of Khazad-dûm and saw something terrible waiting within. He warned the other dwarves that the ancient terror still remained in the depths, and that Durin's folk should not attempt to reclaim their homeland. Yet decades later, despite that warning, one of Thorin's companions would attempt exactly that. That dwarf was Balin, and his expedition would become one of the most tragic episodes in the later history of the dwarves. Understanding what actually happened during Balin's expedition requires turning to the surviving records described by Tolkien. The most important evidence appears in the damaged chronicle discovered by Gandalf and the Fellowship in the Chamber of Mazarbul in the Fellowship of the Ring. This record was written by the dwarves themselves and describes the early years of the colony inside Moria. One of the first readable entries states, "We drove out Orcs from the great gate and God. We slew many in the bright sun in the dale." This brief line tells us something important. When Balin's expedition entered Moria, Orcs were present, but they were not in overwhelming numbers. The dwarves were able to defeat them near the East Gate and secure the entrance to the kingdom. In other words, Balin's people were strong enough to establish a foothold. Later in the same record, Gandalf reads another crucial passage describing the colony's fate. "Balin, Lord of Moria, fell in Dimril Dale. He went alone to look in Mirrormere. An orc shot him from behind a stone." This entry changes how we understand Balin's death. He was not slain in a massive battle within the mines. Instead, he died outside the gates while visiting the sacred lake of Khaled-Zaram, a place of deep significance to Durin's folk. The dwarves later recovered his body and buried him in the Chamber of Mazarbul, the tomb that the Fellowship eventually discovers. The record continues with increasingly desperate entries. "We barred the gates, but cannot hold them long. The watcher in the water took Owen. We cannot get out. Tramps in the deep." The chronicle ends with the haunting final words. "They are coming." Taken together, these entries reveal a clear sequence of events. Balin's expedition successfully entered Moria, drove out Orc forces near the gates, and held the settlement for several years. When we examine Tolkien's evidence carefully, a clearer picture of Balin's expedition begins to emerge. The colony was not immediately destroyed. The surviving record strongly indicates that Balin's people were able to secure the East Gate of Moria and defeat Orcs in the surrounding area. Balin restored the lordship, which would only make sense if the dwarves had regained at least part of the ancient kingdom and were confident enough in their position to declare a restored rule. The length of their survival also reveals something about the scale of Khazad-dûm itself. Moria was not a single set of tunnels, but an enormous underground city with countless levels and chambers. It's entirely possible that large portions of the mines remained unoccupied for long periods of time. This may also explain why the expedition did not encounter the Balrog. Durin's Bane likely remained deep within the lowest caverns of the mountain, far below the levels where Balin's colony had settled. For 5 years, the dwarves rebuilt part of their ancestral home without ever disturbing the ancient terror sleeping beneath them. What ultimately destroyed the colony was something far more mundane: orc numbers, isolation, and lack of reinforcements. After Balin died in Dimril Dale, Orc forces gathered in greater numbers and began attacking the settlement from multiple directions. The record book describes how the dwarves gradually lost control of key passages and halls until they were trapped inside the Chamber of Mazarbul. In other words, Balin's expedition did not fail because the idea was impossible. It failed because the dwarves could not hold Moria alone. So did Balin truly reclaim Moria? In the way that matters most to Durin's folk, he did. For a handful of years, dwarves once again walked the echoing halls of Khazad-dûm as masters, not intruders. They cleared the approaches to the East Gate, rebuilt their own settlement in the dark, and Balin named himself Lord of Moria to signal that this was a reborn realm, not just a doomed adventure. Yet the new kingdom never had deep roots. With Balin slain in Dimril Dale and no steady stream of reinforcements from Erebor, the colony stood alone against the gathering power of the Orcs in the Misty Mountains. Passage by passage, hall by hall, the dwarves were pressed back until their last stand in the Chamber of Mazarbul. When the Fellowship finally entered those same halls, they didn't find a kingdom. They found the memory of one. Balin's tomb, the tattered record of the colony, and the silence of Moria are all that remain of his attempt. For a short time, the kingdom of Durin lived again, and then it was lost once more. But Balin's story is only one moment in the long chain of wars that shaped Middle-earth. To see the full history of those conflicts, watch Every War in Middle-earth Explained next.